Hello, I'm Richard Chambers, Senior Internal Audit Advisor for AuditBoard, and welcome to another in my continuing video series on agents of change. I'm joined today by someone who needs no introduction, Cynthia Cooper. Cynthia is an internationally recognized speaker and consultant and best-selling author and advocate. She's the CEO of Cooper Group, LLC. In 2020, Cynthia was selected by Time magazine to be included in 100 Women of the Year, Time's list of the most influential women of the last 100 years. In 2002, we'll all remember that she was named one of Time magazine's Persons of the Year for her role in unraveling and reporting what would become the largest corporate fraud in history at WorldCom. Cynthia, it's so good to be with you again. It's been 20 years since we first met, and where has the time gone?
I know it. It's hard to believe it's been 20 years.
Yeah, I recall it wasn't long after the WorldCom story broke that you and a colleague came and sat down with Bill Bishop and I at the IA, and we spent an afternoon just allowing you guys to kind of share the experiences you'd been through, and I still remember those events like they were yesterday.
I remember that. That was a poignant moment for me as well. And Bill Bishop was one of the first people who reached out to me after the WorldCom fraud, along with Joe Wells of the ACFE. So very, very much appreciate the support that you guys gave my team and me during that very difficult time.
Yeah, it was a learning experience for me. I came to the IA at the end of 2001, and Enron had just happened and WorldCom was about to happen. So I felt like I was going to a clinic on how corporate frauds unfold, and you were instrumental in helping me understand that.
And I remember when Enron occurred, the Congress thought it was just one bad apple.
Yes.
And so Sarbanes-Oxley was close to passing, and then they put the brakes on it.
That's right. And as I shared on a blog not long ago, it was what I consider the most consequential audit in history, maybe internal audit in history, that you guys did that got everything rolling again and got Congress fully committed to putting the kind of legislation together that we needed. 2022 being the 20th anniversary of the WorldCom debacle, I'm sure you've had a chance to reflect a lot on that experience. And I guess my first question to you would be, what do you think is an overarching lesson or some lessons really for corporate America from the WorldCom events?
Yeah, great question. I don't think for me there's one overarching lesson. I think there are so many lessons. It's so multifaceted. One, I think, is a lesson about human nature, that, fraud has been with us since the beginning of time and will probably always be with us, right? So I think we saw, looking at the common threads across not only WorldCom, but Enron and Tyco and all of these big scandals, that a lot of them were driven by pride and greed and fear and misguided loyalty. So behind the accounting machinations of the fraud schemes themselves, these were really stories about people and choices. And when I talk to students, I tell them we all have the power of choice, right? You can give it away, but nobody can take it from you. So that's one of the lessons. I think you and I have talked before about culture, and certainly making sure that you have a very strong, speak up, transparent, ethical culture is important. That's one of the things that I think came out. The Association of Fraud Examiners indicates that over 50% of all frauds are identified through tips. Mm-hmm. And now, of course, the SEC has a bounty program, as well as the CFTC and the IRS and other organizations. And so it's just critically important that companies make sure that they encourage people to speak up early. The top two reasons people don't come forward are that they are afraid of retaliation, and they don't believe that anything will happen.
And sadly, there are a lot of things that have improved in the last 20 years, but I think some of what you're describing, there's still huge challenges, and they create great underlying risks for organizations. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So as I look back on your career, as you so eloquently shared in your book, Extraordinary Circumstances, The Journey of the Corporate Whistleblower, which, by the way, I've read 3 times, and I can tell you, and my wife will tell you, if I read a book once, it's a miracle. If for me to read a book 3 times, that's truly remarkable. So I think you've symbolized 2 absolutely vital traits of an internal auditor. You brought integrity and courage to your role. How do you differentiate between integrity and courage? And how challenging was it in a place like WorldCom, considering all the obstacles you faced? And frankly, as you've already said, I mean, this is something that people deal with all the time. How do you differentiate between integrity and courage?
Yeah. To me, I view integrity as making sure that you have well-defined moral values, that you know what you stand for, know what you believe in, and that you have the will and the courage to live by those values. So I think courage is just simply one value. Integrity is a value as well, and probably one of the most important values, because if you can't find your courage, then obviously you can't stand up and live by your values when you find yourself at a tough crossroads.
Yeah, I point out a lot. I've known very honest people who didn't have the courage to call out a misbehavior or the courage to do something when they saw something that was clearly wrong that was being done. And I think that's why it was so important for WorldCom and for corporate America to have someone like you who could bring both of those to bear in those extraordinary circumstances, as your book is so aptly titled.
Thank you. I talk to, as you know, I talk to students all the time, but also next generation auditors. Mm-hmm. And I try to encourage them to find their courage, and that we tell them we all have courage within us. We just have to dig down deep and find it sometimes. And in my book, I try to keep it very real. Yeah. I think it's important to be authentic and vulnerable. And I want people to know that I was not this pillar of strength through the entire process. I'm very open about that in the book. Right. That there were times when I was fearful and my hands were shaking. And I think what helped me to find my courage the most was probably my mother. So at a very young age, she was telling my brother and me to think about the consequences of our actions, but also she would always say, don't ever allow yourself to be intimidated. And I think as much as anything that probably her words are what, helped me to find my courage at different points in my life. And the other thing is that I think it's just important for all of us to really be intentional about thinking about what values we want to live by. Who do we want to be? Right. And writing our own personal mission and vision statement.
Oh, that's so true. I tell chief audit executives, and I've done this, I think your book came out around 2008 or 2009, and ever since then, I've been telling people in leadership roles in internal audit that they need to read your book. And at the end of that book, if they couldn't have done the same things you did, that they should ask themselves whether they're in the right role. Because I think that's what this comes down to.
And as we both know, that if you're in the internal audit profession long enough, you are going to find yourself in positions of pressure. You'll find yourself in a position where you're giving bad news and people don't want to hear it. So it really is part of the career. Right. And I think it's important to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Yes. At the very beginning of your career.
That's an absolutely great way of putting it. You've got to be prepared for the worst, and then you'll never find yourself in a situation that you can't handle.
Absolutely.
One of the most compelling aspects of your story is that not only did you have to face down powerful executives at WorldCom, but you had to do so without the enthusiastic backing of your audit committee, and that's probably being kind. What advice would you give to a chief audit executive in particular who finds that they're in a difficult situation, trying to get a difficult message forward, but aren't sure how it's going to be received by the audit committee?
I think my advice would be to, first of all, continue going back to the facts and separate any emotion from the facts of whatever the issue is. Make sure that you do your homework before you go into the audit committee. Think about different ways that you might be able to communicate the situation, because sometimes it's not just what is said, but how it's said. So communication can be very important, perhaps giving different options if there are different paths that can be taken for resolution. Mm-hmm. I think that's important. But in the end, it really does come down to just stepping up to the plate and swinging your bat and doing what you need to do, knowing that there may be a price to pay. And I think it's important to be willing to pay the price, right? It could be your job. It could be a promotion. It could be a cut in budget, but you keep your integrity. And that is, to me, you go back to your very highest value.
Right.
And sometimes our values can collide. So loyalty is an important value. You can't just go breaking rank, but it's not the highest value. So the highest value, or one of the highest values, of course, is honesty, transparency, and being true to your own values.
So, Cynthia, as I said, I'm so impressed not only with your courage and integrity from the experiences that you went through at WorldCom, but also the leadership that you showed as the CAE. I know that there were times where there was a lot of pressure and a lot of stress, not only on you, but on the entire team there as that audit was being undertaken. And yet, I think it was your unwavering strength that got them through it. And it was that leadership. And I guess my question for you would be, what leadership traits, in addition to courage and integrity, do you think chief audit executives need to have?
Let me start just by saying that I was blessed to have an amazing team and an incredible leadership team. Any one of my directors could have stepped right into the chief audit executive position. So I decided early on that if I could not hire many people, that I would hire the best. And most of my team, they had, multiple certifications, multiple degrees, highly qualified, highly skilled team. So very fortunate, very blessed to have that team surrounding me. But as far as leadership skills that I think CAEs should have, not only CAEs, but, senior executives, directors, managers in audit departments, there are many. I think strong communication skills, obviously, is an important one. I think one of the most important things is getting the right people in the right seats. Let's face it, none of us have everything, right? We all have our strengths and our weaknesses. And historically, there's been so much focus on trying to improve your weaknesses. But when you think about it, the people who really excel and succeed find what I call your 3-point zone. So what are you doing when you can easily hit a 3-point shot, right? And it's just effortless. What are your talents, things that just come naturally for you? What are your skills? What are your strengths and those of your team? And that way you can throw the ball to whoever's in the best position to take the shot.
Right.
You can look at the strengths and skills across your organization and see where you might have gaps, those kinds of things.
Cynthia, it's been said that we learn the most about ourselves in times of adversity. And certainly the adversity you went through, I think you chronicled in your book. But what would you say that you learned about yourself in that period that maybe you wouldn't have seen about yourself before? What did you learn in 2002 that you can recall?
That's so true. I think that we learn the most sometimes in those darkest of times, and we all have our doors of adversity. If you live long enough, yours may be different than the person sitting next to you, but we certainly all have our doors. And for me, to this day, I can tell you that going through what I went through at WorldCom was the most difficult time in my life. It was the worst trauma. I think I probably still have some PTSD from going through that. It is very much a trauma, and so many people suffered. And just, watching all that suffering, people
Right.
losing their jobs and their retirements. And so I would say that I grew a tremendous amount through that experience and also through the last 20 years. And I've been, sharing the story, since it happened, that when you go through something like that, it makes you really stop and think about your priorities.
Yeah.
So what matters most in life? What are your values? How do I want to spend my time? And those are some of the things that I began to grapple with. Also, identity. I really struggled with identity for a period of time because I had, obtained my degree and graduate degree. I had my career planned out. And I think what I know is that, and I think this is an important point, especially for young people, is that you're not your career. You're not your career. It's just something you do. and you're not what other people think or say about you, that you have inherent value, and that I still have the same strengths and skills and talents that I had before. I'm just using them in a different way.
Yeah.
That living a life of meaning was the most important thing to me, more than success.
Right.
And so it really changed how I looked at life. And I think that I also am much more, I think I'm more compassionate, more empathetic with other people. And I encourage people to put themselves in the shoes of, as you know, when I speak of other people, the people who committed fraud, or shareholders, employees who lost their jobs, or internal or external audit, and really think about what decisions they might have made and how these events would have impacted them, because we all face these ethical dilemmas. And so I want it to be real to people. I want people to be able to personalize it and take lessons back that they can apply in their personal life as well as in their career.
Right. You know, I recall reading, as I read your book, I felt there were several times that I felt that you had real empathy for some of the underlings who had gotten caught up in this, people who were just sort of following direction. And I felt that empathy coming from you, because I think so often as auditors, we see everything in black and white, and we don't ever stop to put ourselves in someone else's shoes and say, I can almost see how they got caught up in that. Doesn't mean it's not sympathy, and we don't excuse it, and we don't, wipe it under or sweep it under the rug. But that empathy helps us, I think, to understand the circumstances people found themselves in.
I think so too. I think it helps us to understand what the drivers are, the temptations, and to be better auditors, really. I don't think that in the case of WorldCom, the mid-level managers who were complicit were bad people. I think they were pretty average citizens. And I remember giving a presentation a number of years ago with the lead prosecutor who prosecuted Bernie Ebbers, the CEO, and he said, I'll take it a step further. He said, I don't think anyone in this particular case, all the way up to the CEO level, was, quote, a bad person, but you don't have to be a bad person to make terrible decisions that can end up ruining your life and the lives of other people. And I think that's why it's so important that we talk about these cases, that we reflect back on them and try to put ourselves in the shoes of other people, so that when we find ourselves at some crossroads, we'll be more likely to, think it through, find our courage, and make the right choices.